The afternoon was supposed to be simple. Sunlight on plastic streamers, soda cups sweating in the heat, a sheet cake waiting under a clear lid. 12 kids ran barefoot through the yard, laughter spilling everywhere, while adults stood at the edges talking like nothing could touch this moment. Then the sound shifted. Not silence, just less. Fewer footsteps, fewer voices. When the candles were lit, not everyone came back. A parent called a name, then another, louder, sharper. Shoes sat abandoned by the fence. A cup tipped over in the grass. Balloons bobbed gently above a backyard that suddenly felt too big, and no one could say when it happened. Only that 12 children were here, and then they weren't. The afternoon began the way so many summer birthdays did in the early 90s. Bright, unremarkable, and full of the kind of noise adults barely noticed because it meant everything was normal. The sun hung high and generous, washing the backyard in light that bounced off aluminum chairs and plastic tables. Streamers sagged between fence posts, their colors softened by heat. Balloons knocked gently against one another, squeaking when the breeze pushed them together, as if whispering secrets no one bothered to hear. It was the kind of day parents trusted without thinking. A fence yard, familiar neighbors, kids who had grown up on the same streets, whose names were written in permanent marker on school supplies and lunchboxes. 12 children ran in loose circles, barefoot on grass worn thin by years of play. Their laughter rose and fell in uneven bursts, arguments dissolving into giggles, alliances forming and breaking with a speed only children understand. On a long folding table, a sheet cake waited beneath a clear plastic lid. Frosting roses were already beginning to soften, the edges losing definition. Paper plates were stacked too high, napkins weighted down with a rock so they wouldn't scatter. Someone's radio played softly from an open kitchen window, a song that would one day become nostalgic, though no one knew it yet. The birthday child moved through it all like a small king, a paper crown slipping sideways as he ran. He was flushed with excitement, hands sticky with soda and icing. He had waited weeks for this day, counted sleeps, imagined gifts. Around him, the other kids orbited. Friends, cousins, neighbors, classmates. Faces glowed with a simple promise of cake and freedom. Adults hovered at the edges, half present. A mother refilled cups. A father flipped burgers, smoke curling lazily upward. Conversations drifted. Work complaints, weekend plans, harmless gossip. No one was watching the children closely. They didn't need to. This was the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. At some point, someone noticed that the noise had changed. It wasn't silence, not at first. It was thinner somehow. The shrieks softened. The running slowed. A mother glanced up from tying a trash bag and scanned the yard, counting without realizing she was counting. She saw a few kids near the swing set. A couple crouched by the fence, whispering. It felt fine, normal. She turned back to what she was doing. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time as a way of bending around moments that later become important. When the cake was finally brought out, candles flickering unevenly in the heat, the adults called for the children to gather. Voices overlapped. Names were shouted casually, without urgency. Some kids came running, drawn by sugar and ceremony. Others didn't. Someone laughed it off. They're probably in the bathroom. Someone else suggested they were hiding, playing a game. Kids did that. They wandered. They explored. The neighborhood was safe. Another round of calling. Louder this time. A parent wiped their hands on their shorts and walked toward the side of the house, peering around the corner. The yard suddenly felt larger than it had a moment before, as if it had stretched when no one was looking. One child returned alone, breathless, eyes wide with the thrill of having been somewhere forbidden. When asked where the others were, he shrugged. He thought they were behind the garage. Or maybe by the trees. He wasn't sure. He hadn't really been paying attention. The candles burned down, wax dripping onto the cake. Someone pinched them out one by one, the smoke curling upward in thin gray threads. The moment passed without singing. Panic does not arrive all at once. It seeps in through cracks. A parent checked the house. Another walked down the driveway, calling names that now sounded sharper, edged with something unfamiliar. A neighbor was flagged down, asked if they had seen a group of kids pass by. The neighbors shook their head, Confusion mirrored on their face. Phones were pulled from pockets. This was before everyone carried them everywhere, before reassurance was a swipe away. Calls went unanswered. Messages went unsent. The sun continued to shine, indifferent. Someone said the word missing for the first time, then immediately took it back. Don't say that. They're just kids. They'll turn up. But the yard kept emptying. Shoes were found by the fence. A half-finished cup of soda sat sweating on the grass. A party favor bag lay torn open. Candy spilled like evidence no one yet knew how to read. Adults began running. Names were no longer called playfully. They were shouted, cracked with fear. Parents split off in different directions, scanning alleys, backyards, the small wooded strip at the edge of the neighborhood that had always been there and never mattered until now. The world seemed to tilt, familiar streets warping into something unrecognizable. When the police arrived, lights flashing too brightly against the afternoon, the birthday decorations still fluttered behind them. The contrast was unbearable. Balloons bobbed as officers stepped through the gate. Streamers twisted in the breeze above notebooks and radios. 12 children were unaccounted for. The number didn't make sense. It was too large, too heavy to hold. One child going missing was a nightmare. 2 was unthinkable. 12 felt like a mistake, something that must be wrong, because reality simply did not work that way. Parents clung to each other, voices overlapping. Each convinced their child must have been last seen somewhere specific. The stories didn't line up. They couldn't. Everyone had been half watching, trusting the day to take care of itself. The cake melted in the heat, frosting sliding down its sides. Ants gathered at the edges of the table. No one noticed. As the afternoon stretched on, the truth began to settle in with a sickening weight. Whatever had happened, it had happened quietly. No screams. No struggle anyone remembered. No single moment where alarm bells rang. Just a gradual thinning of presence, until absence was all that remained. The party did not end with goodbyes or leftovers packed into foil. It ended with questions hanging in the air, unanswered and multiplying. The backyard, once full of motion and noise, stood eerily still. The toys lay where they had been dropped. The grass bore the faint impressions of small feet that would soon be trampled away by strangers searching for meaning. By evening, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard. The balloons sagged, their colors dimming. The birthday banner fluttered weakly, one corner torn loose. What should have been remembered as a simple celebration became something else entirely, a fixed point in time, frozen and replayed endlessly in the minds of those who were there. Every detail would be examined, every moment questioned. Every laugh would one day feel like a warning no one understood. And beneath it all, an impossible realization took root. 12 children had been present, and then they were not. The party never truly ended. It simply became something the town would carry forever, a moment suspended between innocence and loss, where joy tipped quietly into something no one could name yet, but everyone would feel for the rest of their lives. By the time the number was spoken aloud with certainty, it no longer sounded real. 12. It sat in the air like a misprint, a word that should have been corrected immediately, but wasn't. The officers repeated it to one another, quietly at first, as if lowering their voices might make it less true. 12 children missing from a single afternoon. 12 names that now had to be said together, because saying them one by one was too slow, too painful, too human. They began with lists, not the formal kind yet. Those would come later, but the desperate inventories made by parents whose minds were unraveling in real time. Names were spoken through shaking breaths. Ages followed, then clothing descriptions offered with agonizing precision. Blue shorts, red sneakers, a shirt with a cartoon character whose name no one could quite remember. Each detail felt suddenly vital, as if remembering correctly could somehow reverse what already happened. One mother couldn't stop repeating her son's name, as if afraid it might slip away if she paused. Another father stood rigid, arms crossed so tightly across his chest it looked like he was holding himself together by force alone. A woman fainted when she realized her daughter's bike was still leaning against the fence, untouched. No one caught her in time. The yard filled with voices, but none of them belonged to children anymore. Police radios crackled with fragments of information that didn't connect. Streets were named. Directions were given. Units were dispatched, then redirected. Officers tried to project calm, but their eyes betrayed them. They had seen missing children before. They had never seen this. As the search expanded outward, the 12 became something else. They were no longer just kids from the party. They were a pattern, a shared absence. A single wound cut into 12 different families at once. Reporters arrived before sunset. Cameras hovered at the edges of grief, lenses zooming in on faces that would later be frozen into archival footage. Microphones were held out too close. Parents answered questions they barely understood, words spilling out in fragments that would later be replayed and analyzed for meaning they were never meant to carry. Someone asked how this could happen. No one had an answer. The children's names were finally written down together, side by side, ink pressing into paper as if permanence could be forced onto something so unstable. Seeing them like that, aligned in a column, made it worse. They looked like a roster, a class list, something that implied order, when everything about the situation was chaos. Each name carried a story the search could not capture. One child had begged to come to the party at the last minute. Another had almost stayed home, complaining of a stomachache that mysteriously vanished the moment cake was mentioned. One was shy, known for hanging back at the edge of games. Another was fearless, always the first to climb higher, run faster, dare more. Those differences did not matter now. They had been flattened into a single fact: missing. Night fell hard. Flashlights cut through backyards and ditches. Volunteers gathered, faces grim, forming lines that moved methodically through the neighborhood. They called out names into the darkness, their voices echoing back unanswered. Dogs barked somewhere in the distance, restless and confused by the sudden activity. Inside the houses, time stopped. Bedrooms became unbearable. Some parents couldn't enter them at all. Others went straight in, touching familiar objects as if they were lifelines. A half-made bed, a school backpack slung over a chair, posters peeling slightly at the corners. Everything exactly as it had been left, as if waiting for a return that had not yet been ruled out, but was already feared. Phones rang constantly. Friends, relatives, strangers who thought they might have seen something. Each call raised hope, then dropped it again. The emotional whiplash was relentless. Parents learned quickly that hope could hurt just as much as despair. By morning, the number 12 had spread far beyond the town. It appeared in headlines, on radio broadcasts, in whispered conversations between people who had never heard of the place until now. It became shorthand for something monstrous and undefined. The town's name followed it everywhere, forever tied to what had happened there. But numbers have a way of numbing. They make tragedy feel distant, abstract. Inside the homes of the missing children, there was nothing abstract about it. One father sat at the kitchen table all night, staring at a list he had written himself. His son's name circled again and again until the paper tore. A mother replayed the afternoon in her mind on a loop, interrogating every choice, every moment she hadn't been watching closely enough. The questions came fast and merciless. Why didn't I count them sooner? Why didn't I notice the silence? Why did I assume everything was fine? Guilt settled in early, heavy and invasive. It didn't matter that no one could explain what had happened. Parents blamed themselves anyway. It felt necessary, almost logical. If this was random, if it could happen without reason, then nothing was safe. Blame at least gave the illusion of control. As the hours turned into days, the 12 children began to exist in two places at once. They were gone, and yet they were everywhere. Their faces appeared on photocopied flyers taped to poles and windows. Their names were spoken in prayer circles and shouted into megaphones. They occupied the thoughts of people who had never met them, who felt suddenly compelled to imagine their own children in that absence. The birthday child's name was mentioned often, always with a pause afterward. There was something especially cruel about that detail, that the day meant to celebrate his life had become the point where it vanished from public view. His cake was photographed by investigators, its melted frosting now an accidental symbol that would resurface in documentaries and articles decades later. No evidence explained why these 12, on this day, in this place. That uncertainty gnawed at everyone differently. Some clung to theories almost immediately, desperate to make sense of the senseless. Others rejected speculation entirely, retreating inward, conserving emotional energy for the long wait they sensed was coming. Children from nearby streets were kept indoors. Playgrounds emptied. Birthday parties were canceled. The town's rhythm changed overnight. Laughter became something people listened for with suspicion. In quiet moments, when no one was watching, some parents still imagined their children walking back through the door. The brain reached for normalcy even as reality resisted it. They pictured excuses, lost track of time, followed a friend, didn't realize anyone was worried. Those thoughts came uninvited and left devastation in their wake. The list of names remained taped to the command center wall, updated with notes and timelines that grew more complex by the hour. But the core remained the same. 12 children, one afternoon. No clear explanation. As the search stretched on, something subtle but profound shifted. The disappearances stopped being an event and started becoming a condition. The families realized, slowly and painfully, that whatever this was, it would not be resolved quickly. It had already embedded itself into their lives, reshaping futures that had once seemed certain. The birthday decorations were taken down eventually, folded and thrown away by someone who didn't know what else to do with them. But the day itself could not be packed up so easily. It lingered, replaying fragments. The sound of running feet, the smear of frosting on a child's cheek, the moment when counting became necessary. 12 names, one afternoon, and a growing, unbearable understanding that the story had only just begun. The town did not change all at once. It hardened gradually, like something exposed to cold too suddenly. At first, people stayed outside longer than usual, clustering in small groups at the ends of driveways, trading information in hushed tones. They leaned toward one another, voices low, eyes darting as if the missing children might somehow overhear. There was a shared urgency then, a belief that if everyone paid close enough attention, the children would be found. Doors were left open. Porch lights stayed on through the night. No one wanted to be alone. By the second day, that openness began to close in on itself. Police tape appeared where there had once been shortcuts. Patrol cars idled on streets that had never known flashing lights. Officers knocked on doors not to introduce themselves, but to ask questions that felt invasive even when they were necessary. Had you seen anything unusual? Anyone you didn't recognize? Any unfamiliar vehicles? The questions were reasonable. The answers were not helpful. Everyone had seen nothing, noticed nothing, remembered too little. Neighbors who had known each other for years began replaying past interactions with new suspicion. The man who walked his dog late at night. The woman who never came to block parties. The quiet family at the corner house who kept their curtains drawn. Innocent quirks were reinterpreted as potential warning signs. Familiarity turned brittle. Children were no longer allowed to wander. Parents walked them to school, even if it meant being late for work. Playdates were supervised with vigilance that bordered on panic. Windows were locked. Back gates were checked twice. The town developed a new sound. The click of deadbolts, the hum of alarm systems hastily installed. At the grocery store, conversation stopped when someone new entered the aisle. People watched one another with careful neutrality, as if politeness itself had become dangerous. Everyone was measuring everyone else, silently asking the same unspoken question. Could it have been you? The missing children's faces stared back from every surface. Flyers layered over one another on telephone poles, their edges curling in the sun. Storefront windows displayed them in uneven rows, tape peeling slightly, the images fading with exposure. At first, people stopped to read every one. They memorized details. They pointed out similarities to their own kids. Over time, they began to look away. The pain of recognition became too much. The town geography changed in people's minds. Streets were no longer just routes. They were possibilities. The wooded strip that had once been a place for forts and hide and seek became something ominous. Parents crossed the street to avoid it. Teenagers dared each other to walk near it after dark, their bravado thin and performative. Fear had turned the familiar into a map of imagined threats. Churches filled beyond capacity. Prayer circles formed in living rooms and parking lots. Candles flickered in windows at night, small points of light against the darkness. Faith became both refuge and battlefield. Some clung to it desperately. Others turned away, angry that belief offered no protection. The town's grief fractured along invisible lines. News coverage intensified the pressure. Reporters speculated openly, filling airtime with theories that had no grounding but plenty of emotional pull. Every angle was examined. Every possibility aired. The town watched itself reflected back through screens, distorted and simplified. Residents recognized their streets, but not their story. Rumors spread faster than facts ever could. Someone claimed they heard a scream late that afternoon. Someone else swore they saw a van parked too long near the party. A third insisted the children must have wandered off together, following something or someone. Each rumor gained traction, then collapsed under scrutiny, leaving behind only more unease. The lack of answers created space for imagination to run unchecked. Social ties strained under the weight of constant fear. Old disagreements resurfaced, now sharpened by accusation. A neighbor's offhand comment was remembered as suspicious. A long-forgotten argument was recast as motive. People who had borrowed sugar from one another a week earlier now avoided eye contact. The town council held emergency meetings that accomplished little beyond airing collective anxiety. Curfews were discussed. Patrols were increased. Hotlines were established. None of it brought the children back. None of it eased the underlying dread that had settled into the town's bones. At night, the silence felt different. It was heavier, charged. Every sound was amplified. A passing car sent curtains twitching. A dog barking set hearts racing. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams that blurred into waking panic. Parents checked their children's rooms repeatedly, needing visual confirmation that they were still there. Some residents tried to leave. They packed bags and drove to stay with relatives, claiming it was temporary. Others stayed, unable or unwilling to abandon a place that now felt like both home and crime scene. For those who left, guilt followed closely behind. For those who stayed, so did suspicion. Children sensed a change even if they couldn't articulate it. They absorbed fear from the air, from hushed conversations, from the way adults flinched at sudden noises. Play became subdued. Laughter was tentative. They learned quickly that something had gone terribly wrong, and that the world was not as predictable as they had believed. The town's identity began to erode. It was no longer known for its schools or its quiet streets or its annual summer festival. It became the place where 12 children vanished. That label clung to it, reshaping how outsiders saw it and how residents saw themselves. Pride gave way to defensiveness. Any mention of the town's name carried an implied question mark. Inside homes, families argued about safety, about whether they had done enough, about whether they could ever do enough. Stress seeped into every interaction. Some marriages cracked under pressure. Others grew tense but unbreakable, partners clinging to one another out of sheer necessity. The sense of being watched never fully left. Even when no cameras were present, even when reporters moved on to the next story, the town felt exposed, like it had been opened up and left vulnerable. Its private grief turned into public spectacle. Yet beneath the fear and suspicion, something else persisted, a fragile, stubborn connection. People still showed up for search efforts. They still brought food to the command center. They still lit candles together. Even as trust fractured, the shared loss bound them in ways they did not yet understand. The town locked its doors, but it could not lock out memory. Every corner held a reminder. Every familiar place felt altered, as if the disappearance had left an invisible residue that no amount of time could fully erase. What had once been a backdrop for ordinary life became a constant source of unease. The town did not know it then, but it was stepping into a long future defined not by what it was, but by what it had lost, and by the questions that would follow it wherever it went. From the outside, the response looked immediate and overwhelming. Patrol cars lined the streets. Uniforms moved with purpose. Clipboards filled with notes. Radios crackled endlessly, a constant reminder that something was being done. But beneath the surface of activity, there was no clear shape to what was unfolding. The investigation began not as a plan, but as a reaction, fragmented, urgent, and already struggling to keep up with the enormity of what was facing. The first problem was time. No one could say exactly when the children had disappeared. The party had flowed without structure. Kids drifting in and out of sight, adults assuming someone else was watching. That missing window, those undefined minutes or hours, became a black hole, without a clear starting point. Every lead felt both possible and useless. Officers retraced steps that no one could fully remember. They walked the backyard again and again, measuring distances, noting fences and sight lines. They examined the side of the house, the garage, the narrow paths that led away from the yard. Each route raised new questions. Each question opened into more uncertainty. Witness statements contradicted one another in small but crucial ways. One neighbor thought the children had been playing near the trees later than others remembered. Someone else was certain they had seen a group heading toward the street, but couldn't say when or how many. Memories blurred under pressure, reshaped by fear and hindsight. Investigators learned quickly that certainty was a luxury they did not have. The sheer number of missing children distorted normal procedure. Protocols were built around singular cases, not 12 simultaneous absences. Resources were stretched thin almost immediately. Search teams were formed and reformed. Areas were cleared, then cleared again, because no one trusted the first pass. Dogs were brought in, their handlers tense, waiting for any signal that might anchor the chaos. Nothing held. The yard yielded no signs of struggle, no damaged fences, no discarded clothing that clearly didn't belong. What little evidence existed was ambiguous to the point of meaninglessness. A scuffed patch of grass could have been anything. A broken branch meant nothing in a place where children climbed and played every day. The normal way of life masqueraded as potential clues, and investigators had to decide constantly what to follow and what to let go. Parents watched on the edges as the process unfolded, desperate to see order emerge. Some asked questions. Others stayed silent, afraid of interfering. They wanted assurance, and what they received instead was procedure, careful, methodical, and painfully slow. By the second day, outside agencies were notified. The involvement of the FBI was discussed, then approved. Their arrival carried weight, a sense that the situation had crossed an invisible threshold. To some, it felt like validation of their worst fears. To others, it was a fragile lifeline. Federal agents reviewed what little existed. Timelines that didn't align, statements that overlapped while confirming one another, a scene that refused to give itself up. They asked different questions, pushed in different directions, but the underlying problem remained the same. There was nothing solid to push against. Leads poured in anyway. Calls flooded tip lines, overwhelming the system. People from neighboring towns, from other states, claimed to have seen something. A group of children walking along a highway. A van idling at a gas station. A suspicious man asking questions. Each tip had to be logged, evaluated, followed up. Most led nowhere. Some led back to the same dead ends investigators had already encountered. The pressure to find something, anything, mounted with every passing hour. Media scrutiny intensified. Cameras lingered on command posts, waiting for updates that didn't come. Investigators felt the weight of expectation, not just from the families, but from the entire country watching. Inside the command center, maps were covered in pins and markings that grew more complex and less helpful over time. The lines connecting them began to resemble speculation more than evidence. Patterns were suggested, then dismissed. The case resisted coherence. Frustration seeped into every interaction. Officers snapped at one another. Agents worked long hours fueled by caffeine and adrenaline, only to end their shifts with nothing new to report. The lack of progress was not due to inaction, but it felt like failure all the same. The investigation had another, quieter problem: assumption. People wanted to believe there was a single explanation, a single event that could account for everything. A mass abduction, a coordinated act, something that fit within the boundaries of known crimes. Investigators wrestled with those assumptions, testing them against what little they knew. The theories were big, dramatic, and unsupported. The possibility that the truth might be stranger, less obvious, or deeply uncomfortable linger at the edges, unspoken. It was easier to chase familiar narratives than to confront the idea that the case did not fit any existing mold. As days turned into weeks, the investigation began to lose momentum, not in effort, but in direction. Searches became more targeted, then more repetitive. The same areas were revisited out of necessity, not confidence. New information failed to emerge. Parents noticed a shift. They sensed it in the tone of briefings, in the careful phrasing of updates. Words like ongoing and active replaced any suggestion of imminent resolution. Hope, once buoyed by sheer activity, became fragile. Behind closed doors, investigators debated strategy. Some argued for narrowing focus, committing fully to a single theory. Others warned against tunnel vision, insisting that the absence of evidence demanded broader thinking. The discussions were tense, unresolved. No one wanted to be responsible for missing the one detail that might have mattered. The children remained absent, their whereabouts as unknowable as they had been on the first night. Files grew thicker. Notes piled up. The case acquired a physical weight that mirrored its emotional one. Every document represented time, effort, and unanswered questions. Investigators understood, even then, that this case would follow them for the rest of their careers. What haunted them most was not what they found, but what they didn't. No ransom demands. No credible sightings. No definitive proof of what had happened after the party ended. The children had vanished into a space the investigation could not penetrate. The structure everyone wanted, the clean sequence of cause and effect, never materialized. Instead, the case existed as a collection of fragments, each insufficient on its own and resistant to assembly. From the outside, it still looked like a massive operation. From inside, it felt like grasping at smoke. And as the investigation pressed forward, driven by duty and desperation, a quiet, unsettling truth began to take shape among those closest to the case. Whatever had happened to children had left almost no trace behind, and that absence might be the most disturbing clue of all. Grief did not arrive in a single wave. It came in cycles, uneven and relentless, reshaping the lives of the parents in ways they could not have imagined on the afternoon of the party. In the early days, shock carried them. It allowed them to function, to answer questions, to stand in front of cameras and say their child's name without collapsing. But shock is temporary. When it faded, something heavier took its place. Sleep became fragmented, then optional, then almost impossible. Parents lay awake listening for sounds that would never come. The creak of a bedroom door, footsteps in the hallway, a whispered request for water. Some slept in their children's rooms, surrounded by familiar objects, as if proximity might summon them back. Others avoided those spaces entirely, sealing doors shut like wounds that could not yet be cleaned. Time warped, days blurred together, defined only by search briefings and phone calls that raised hope before crushing it. Nights stretched endlessly. Parents learned to measure time in smaller units. Minutes since the last update, hours since they had last eaten, seconds spent staring at a phone willing it to ring. Birthdays came and went without candles. Holidays passed quietly, stripped of ritual. Families who had once gathered easily now moved around one another with caution, unsure how to celebrate anything without acknowledging who was missing. Empty chairs at tables became unbearable symbols. Some were removed. Others were left untouched, a silent refusal to accept absence as permanent. Marriages strained under the weight of incompatible grief. Some parents needed to talk constantly, replaying details again and again, searching for meaning. Others retreated inward, conserving energy, unable to speak without unraveling. Words failed, then became weapons. Arguments erupted over small things, whether to keep searching the same areas, whether to speak to the media again, whether to hope. Blame crept in quietly. It did not always announce itself. Sometimes it disguised itself as regret, as second-guessing, as endless mental replays of the day. Why didn't I notice sooner? Why didn't I insist they stay in the yard? Why did I assume someone else was watching? Parents interrogated their own memories until they became unreliable, reshaped by guilt and longing. Some turned that blame outward, toward neighbors, toward investigators, toward the other parents at the party. Relationships fractured under the pressure of unspoken accusations. Even when no one said it aloud, the question lingered between them. Could this have been prevented? The homes themselves began to feel different. Rooms grew stale, untouched. Toys gathered dust. Clothes remained folded where they had last been placed, no longer outgrown, no longer worn. Parents struggled with impossible decisions. Do you keep buying clothes just in case? Do you give things away? Do you preserve everything exactly as it was? Or does that trap you in a moment you can never escape? Grief made ordinary tasks monumental. Grocery shopping felt pointless when there was no child to ask for cereal they liked. Laundry felt absurd without small socks to match. Parents described feeling detached from the world, as if life were happening behind glass, visible but unreachable. Friends tried to help. They brought meals. They offered childcare for siblings who still needed attention. They sat in silence when words failed. But over time, even well-meaning support became complicated. People didn't know what to say anymore. They worried about reopening wounds, not realizing the wounds never closed. Invitations slowed, then stopped. The parents noticed. Some parents clung to routines as a form of survival. They woke up at the same time every day. They walked the same routes their children once had. They kept busy, filling every moment to avoid the quiet where thoughts grew too loud. Others withdrew completely, letting days pass unnoticed, marked only by the ache that never receded. Hope was a dangerous thing. It flickered unpredictably, ignited by rumors, by unverified sightings, by dreams that felt too vivid to dismiss. Each resurgence of hope carried the risk of deeper devastation. Parents learned to brace themselves, to expect disappointment, but the heart did not always cooperate. Guilt followed hope closely. How dare I imagine them alive when so many days have passed? How dare I think of moving forward? Parents felt trapped between longing and loyalty, unsure which emotions were permissible. Siblings were affected in quieter ways. They watched their parents change, becoming older overnight, burdened by something too heavy to explain. Some felt invisible, competing with absence for attention. Others became fiercely protective, afraid of being lost too. Childhood ended early in those households. Counselors and support groups offered language for what parents were experiencing, but words felt inadequate. There was no roadmap for this kind of loss, no closure to work toward. Traditional grief assumed finality. This did not. What haunted many parents most was the not knowing. Death, as terrible as it is, carries an ending. This carried only questions. Were they scared? Were they together? Did they know they were loved? Those questions replayed endlessly, unanswered, unanswerable. As months turned into years, the acute pain dulled slightly, but it never disappeared. It settled into something chronic, a low, constant ache punctuated by sharp spikes of memory. Parents learned to function alongside it, but it shaped everything. Decisions were filtered through absence. Futures were rewritten without consent. Some parents became advocates, pushing relentlessly for continued investigation, refusing to let the case fade. Others stepped back, emotionally exhausted, unable to endure the cycle of hope and disappointment any longer. Both choices carried guilt. Both choices hurt. Anniversaries of the disappearance were especially brutal. The date loomed each year, impossible to ignore. Some families gathered together. Others stayed apart, honoring grief privately. Media attention briefly resurfaced, reopening wounds that had barely begun to scar over. Through it all, one truth remained constant. Sleep never returned to what it had been. Parents described waking suddenly, heart racing, convinced for a moment that their child was calling them. The realization that followed was always fresh, always devastating. They aged differently than their peers. Faces lined faster, hair grayed sooner. Grief carved itself into their bodies, visible to those who knew how to look. They carried their children with them everywhere, not in photographs or stories alone, but in posture, in expression, in the way joy was always tempered by restraint. The world moved on, but the parents did not. They lived in a suspended state, caught between past and present, holding space for children who never came home. Love did not fade. If anything, it intensified, sharpened by longing, and every night Before sleep claimed them or refused to, the same thought returned, quiet and unrelenting. Somewhere, their child existed or didn't, and the not knowing was a weight they would carry for the rest of their lives. At first, the camera stayed. News vans lined the streets, engines idling, satellite dishes tilted toward the sky like mechanical flowers. Reporters spoke in urgent tones, repeating the same phrases over and over, as if repetition might force a breakthrough. The town watched itself on television each night, searching the screen for something that felt different, something hopeful. Every update felt important, even when there was nothing new to say. Then, slowly, the updates grew shorter. Other stories crept in from the edges. Elections, storms, scandals elsewhere. The disappearance of 12 children, once unthinkable, began to compete for attention. The urgency softened. Headlines shrank. Anchors shifted their posture when speaking about it. Their voices no longer charged with disbelief, but with practiced gravity. The families noticed immediately. Press conferences were scheduled less often. Fewer microphones appeared. Reporters stopped knocking on doors unannounced. Calls that once came daily slowed to a trickle. The world, it seemed, was learning how to look away. Missing posters began to blend into the background of everyday life. Sun and rain faded the ink. Corners peeled back. Some were torn down by vandals. Others were removed by store owners who needed window space. Each disappearance of a poster felt like a second loss, smaller but no less painful. In the town, routines cautiously resumed. Schools reopened fully. Children were allowed outside again, though under stricter rules. Life had to continue. People said, bills still came. Jobs still demanded attention. But everything felt provisional, as if reality itself were on loan. Conversations about the case became awkward. People didn't know when it was appropriate to bring it up. Silence crept into social spaces where concern had once been openly shared. Grief, once communal, became individualized. Those directly affected carried alone. The investigation continued, but its visibility diminished. Search areas narrowed. Updates became technical, harder for the public to follow. The absence of dramatic developments made it easier for outsiders to assume nothing was happening, even when work persisted behind closed doors. For the families, the fading attention felt like betrayal. They understood, intellectually, that the world could not stay frozen. Emotionally, it felt like abandonment. Their children were still gone. The pain was still fresh. Yet the collective urgency had evaporated. Some parents tried to keep the story alive. They gave interviews when asked, even when it meant reopening wounds. They spoke at community events, at schools, at any place that would listen. They clung to the belief that visibility mattered, that being remembered increased the chances of answers. Others withdrew. They could not endure the cycle of public hope followed by silence. They protected themselves by shrinking their worlds, focusing inward, where expectations were lower and disappointment more manageable. The town itself seemed to exhale, relieved in a way that felt shameful. Constant vigilance had been exhausting. Fear had worn everyone down. As attention faded, people allowed themselves to feel normal again. Even if that normal was forever altered, new families moved in, drawn by affordable houses and quiet streets. They heard about the disappearance in fragments, if at all. A neighbor might mention it casually, or they might discover years later through an old article or a whispered comment. For them, it was history. For others, it was an open wound. The children's names stopped appearing in daily conversation. Anniversaries came and went with little public acknowledgement beyond brief mentions in local papers. Candlelight vigils grew smaller each year, attended mostly by those who had no choice but to remember. The case files thickened, then settled. Investigators changed assignments. New officers were briefed on the basics, absorbing the story secondhand. Without the visceral memory of those first frantic days, the emotional intensity diluted with distance. Speculation hardened into lore. People spoke about the disappearance in the past tense, even though nothing had been resolved. The language shifted subtly. Had vanished became had gone missing. Had gone missing became the case from years ago. Each phrasing carried more distance, more finality. For the families, time did not soften the loss. It only changed its texture. Acute pain gave way to a steady ache, easy to carry but impossible to set down. The lack of answers gnawed quietly, resurfacing in unexpected moments. A child the same age as theirs would have been, a song from the 90s, a familiar street corner. The disappearance became something the town lived around rather than inside. It shaped decisions and behaviors without being openly acknowledged. Parents still locked doors. Children still had curfews. The fear never fully disappeared. It just learned how to coexist with daily life. There was a sense, unspoken but pervasive, that the story had ended without an ending, that the book had been closed mid-sentence, and everyone had agreed to pretend that was acceptable. It was easier than living in constant anticipation of news that might never come. Some residents felt guilty for the relief they experienced as attention faded. Others felt angry that relief had come at all. The disappearance had exposed how fragile safety was, how quickly normalcy could shatter. Forgetting felt like denial. Years passed. The town changed in visible ways. Businesses closed. New ones opened. Children grew up, unaware of the weight their streets once carried. Adults aged. Memories faded at the edges. But for those closest to the loss, nothing truly moved on. The absence remained fixed, immune to time. Each day without answers felt like a quiet erasure, as if the world were slowly writing over the space their children once occupied. The story had stopped being news, but it had not stopped being real. It lingered in the margins, waiting unresolved, a reminder that some questions do not fade simply because the world grows tired of asking them. The rumors began quietly, almost politely, as if they didn't want to draw attention to themselves. A comment overheard in a diner, a late-night phone call that ended abruptly when questions were asked, a story passed along with disclaimer, probably nothing, but still. After years of silence, even the faintest suggestion of movement felt electric. Someone claimed they had seen a familiar face in another state, older but unmistakable. The age didn't line up perfectly, but trauma has a way of blurring timelines. Another person insisted they recognized a laugh, a way of tilting the head, something that couldn't be explained but felt certain. These accounts spread unevenly, igniting hope in some and suspicion in others. Investigators learned about the rumors the same way everyone else did, through calls, letters, and secondhand retellings that lost precision with every retelling. Each one had to be logged. Each one had to be considered, no matter how unlikely. Ignoring a tip felt dangerous. Following it often felt futile. Parents reacted differently. Some chased every rumor relentlessly, traveling long distances on little more than instinct and desperation. They studied photographs of strangers, searching for familiar features. They compared timelines, heights, scars, the possibility that their child had survived, even in circumstances they didn't yet want to imagine, was too powerful to dismiss. Others refused to engage. They had learned the cost of hope. Each rumor, they knew, carried the potential to reopen wounds they had spent years learning how to live with. They protected themselves by remaining skeptical, by demanding proof they knew would likely never come. The town listened, half involved, half exhausted. People debated the rumors in private, careful not to voice speculation too loudly. No one wanted to be responsible for giving false hope. No one wanted to be the one who said, "This means nothing." Some rumors were elaborate. They spoke of secret networks, of coordinated efforts that explained how so many children could vanish without trace. These theories grew more complex over time, feeding on unanswered questions and collective frustration. They offered narrative where the investigation had not. They promised order in chaos. Others were painfully simple. A child spotted walking alone, a name overheard, a resemblance too strong to ignore. These stories carried emotional weight because they felt plausible, grounded in everyday moments where the extraordinary could hide unnoticed. Investigators struggled to balance openness with realism. They pursued leads methodically, knowing most would collapse under scrutiny. Each dead end reinforced a familiar pattern: excitement, anticipation, disappointment. The cycle became routine. One rumor, however, refused to fade. It surfaced years after the disappearance, quietly but persistently. A former resident, long since moved away, contacted authorities with memory that had troubled him for decades. At the time, it had seemed insignificant. Now, viewed through the lens of what had happened, it felt different. They described seeing a group of children together later than the accepted timeline, led by someone they couldn't clearly describe. The details were vague, but the conviction was strong. The statement was inconsistent with previous assumptions. It didn't fit neatly into existing theories. That alone made it unsettling. Investigators revisited old files, comparing notes that had once seemed unrelated. They re-interviewed witnesses who had long ago resigned themselves to being forgotten. Some memories had faded. Others had sharpened with time, shaped by years of reflection and regret. Parents were notified carefully. The information was presented with caution, stripped of certainty. Still, it was enough to stir something dormant. Old routines returned. Checking phones obsessively, staying awake late, rehearsing conversations that might never happen. The rumor did not lead to immediate answers. It did something subtler. It disrupted the accepted narrative. For years, the disappearance had been understood in a certain way. The lack of evidence had hardened assumptions, even if they were never spoken aloud. The children were gone. The story was over. The rumors challenged that finality. The town reacted with unease. Some residents welcomed the renewed attention, hoping it might finally force resolution. Others resented it, fearing the reopening of wounds they had tried to seal. The possibility that the truth had been missed all along was both thrilling and terrifying. Late at night, conversations resumed. People speculated quietly, revisiting old memories with new suspicion. Had they overlooked something? Had they dismissed a detail too quickly? The past felt suddenly unstable, open to reinterpretation. For the families, the emotional toll was immense. Hope surged and receded unpredictably. Dreams returned, vivid, disorienting, convincing. Parents woke with the sensation that something was about to change, that answers were close enough to touch. But days passed, then weeks. The rumor did not solidify into proof. It lingered, unresolved, adding another layer of uncertainty to an already unbearable history. Time did not heal the disappearance. It reorganized it. What had once been sharp and immediate settled into something heavier, something that followed people quietly instead of crashing into them. 31 years passed not as a straight line, but as a slow accumulation of ordinary days built around an extraordinary absence. The children who vanished would have been adults now. That fact hovered over everything, impossible to ignore and impossible to fully grasp. Parents aged into versions of themselves they did not recognize. Lines appeared on faces that had once been smooth. Hair thinned, grayed, then disappeared altogether. Bodies slowed. Illnesses arrived. Some parents retired. Others did not live long enough to reach that point. Through it all, the disappearance remained the defining event of their lives, the moment everything else was measured against. In their minds, the children did not age the same way. They remained suspended somewhere between who they were and who they might have become. Parents struggled with this dissonance. When they imagined their children, were they still small, laughing in a backyard? Or were they grown, changed by experiences no one could see? Both images coexisted, equally painful. Photographs became complicated objects. At first, parents displayed them everywhere, refusing to let the faces fade from view. Over time, some photos were moved into drawers, not out of forgetfulness, but out of survival. Seeing the same frozen smile day after day became unbearable. Others kept the photos exactly where they had always been, dusting the frames carefully, as if tending to something alive. The case itself settled into a strange limbo, officially open, practically dormant. Files remained stored, accessible but untouched for long stretches. New investigators rotated in occasionally, briefed on the basics, absorbing the story intellectually rather than emotionally. They did their due diligence, reviewed evidence, ran checks that technology had made newly possible. Most found nothing new. Each time the case resurfaced, even briefly, it disrupted the fragile equilibrium families had built. Old fears returned. Old arguments reignited. Hope and dread resurfaced together, inseparable. Parents learned to approach any mention of progress with guarded distance. They had been disappointed too many times to do otherwise. The town marked the passing years in quieter ways. There were fewer public memorials, fewer speeches. The anniversary of the disappearance was acknowledged in small articles, sometimes not at all. When it was mentioned, it was framed as history, something that belonged to the past rather than the present. But the past never stayed where it was supposed to. Every generation of children in the town grew up hearing fragments of the story. It was told as a warning, as a cautionary tale about trust and safety. Parents referenced it when setting rules. Don't wander too far. Stay where I can see you. It became part of the town's cultural fabric, shaping behavior long after the details had faded. Some residents resented this legacy. They wanted the town to be known for something else. Others felt a responsibility to remember, to ensure the story was not erased entirely. This quiet tension persisted, rarely discussed openly but always present. For the families, the years without answers were a unique kind of punishment. There was no legal resolution, no grave to visit, no ritual that marked an end. They existed in a permanent middle, unable to fully grieve and unable to fully hope. Therapists struggled to name it. Friends struggled to understand it. The world offered language like closure and moving on. Those words felt insulting. There was nothing to close. There was nowhere to move on to. Life continued, yes, but it did not replace what had been lost. Some parents eventually stopped attending anniversaries and support groups, not because they cared less, but because the repetition became too painful. Others attended every year, their present a quiet act of defiance against forgetting. Both choices were born of the same love. As decades passed, the story grew quieter, but it also grew heavier. The weight of unanswered questions compounded with time. Had mistakes been made early on? Had something been missed? The longer the case remained unsolved, the harder it became to believe that answers would ever come. Parents replayed conversations from the early days, wondering whether they had pushed hard enough, demanded more, noticed something important in passing. Regret became a companion, persistent and unrelenting. Technology advanced. DNA databases expanded. Cold cases were solved elsewhere, sometimes decades later. Each breakthrough reignited hope, followed closely by despair when it did not translate to their own situation. The question returned, always the same. Why not us? The children's names appeared occasionally in documentaries, podcasts, articles about unsolved cases. Each mention brought a surge of attention, brief and intense. Families were contacted, asked to relive their worst moments for the sake of storytelling. The case did not resurface with fanfare. There were no sirens, no press releases, no sudden rush of cameras back into the town. It began quietly, the way most long-buried things do, through routine, through paperwork, through a question that had not been asked in exactly that way before. A review, not because of a tip, not because of a confession, because time had passed and systems had changed. Cold cases across the country were being revisited, not out of optimism, but obligation. Files digitized, evidence recatalogued, old assumptions tested against new tools. The disappearance of 12 children had always sat uncomfortably in the archives, too large to ignore, too unsolved to resolve. It resurfaced not as urgency, but as unfinished business. The agents assigned to it were not the ones who had lived through the first days. They did not carry the emotional weight of the original search. That distance mattered. They approached the case without reverence, without the quiet fear of disturbing something sacred. To them, it was data first, story second. They began by rebuilding the timeline from the ground up, not relying on summaries or conclusions, but on raw material. Original witness statements, handwritten notes, audio recordings whose tape hiss had not been heard in decades. They noticed inconsistencies that had once been dismissed as stress or memory failure, not because those early investigators were careless, but because they were overwhelmed. One detail, long considered relevant, began to draw attention. It was small, embarrassingly small, a logistical note buried in supplemental paperwork, something that had never been highlighted because it didn't point anywhere obvious. It didn't contradict the prevailing theories strongly enough to demand attention. It simply didn't fit cleanly. The agents didn't know yet what it meant. They only knew it didn't belong where it had been placed. As they cross-referenced it with newly digitized materials, Patterns began to emerge. Not answers, but questions sharper than the ones that had come before. The absence of evidence, once seen as a dead end, was reframed as something else entirely. Not emptiness. Selectivity. The children had vanished without noise, without witnesses who agreed, without a traceable path outward. For decades, this had been treated as proof of sophistication, coordination, or sheer bad luck. Now, it began to look like something else. Containment. The FBI team moved slowly. They did not want to alert families or the public until they understood what they were looking at. Premature hope was damage they did not want to cause again. They worked in controlled silence, re-interviewing retired officers, rereading transcripts, re-examining maps with modern spatial analysis. One thing became increasingly clear. The investigation in the early days had not failed because it lacked effort. It had failed because it had trusted the shape of the problem too quickly. Everyone had assumed the disappearance was outward, away from the party, away from the neighborhood, away from the familiar. That assumption had dictated search patterns, resource allocation, theory building. The new team questioned that assumption directly. They asked what it meant that no credible sightings had ever emerged beyond a certain radius. What it meant that every rumor placing the children elsewhere collapsed under scrutiny. What it meant that the last confirmed moments of their presence were so tightly clustered in time and space. They revisited the party site with fresh eyes, not as a crime scene frozen in the 90s, but as a physical environment. Sightlines, sound travel, access points, areas that would not register as suspicious in daylight, in familiarity, in trust. The absence of disturbance suddenly felt louder than any sign of violence would have. They began to consider that the lack of chaos was the point. This was not something the FBI wanted to believe. Mass disappearances almost always left fractures, panic, witnesses, mistakes. This one hadn't. It suggested a different kind of mechanism, one that relied not on force, but on expectation. Children followed rules. Children followed instructions. Children trusted adults in familiar spaces. The case took on a psychological dimension that earlier investigations had brushed past in favor of logistics. As technology entered the process, old evidence found new voices. Audio recordings were cleaned, background noise isolated. Nothing dramatic surfaced, no screams, no commands, but subtle anomalies appeared. Sound that didn't belong. Pauses that had once been ignored. A pattern emerged across multiple witness statements. Moments where attention drifted. Where adults assumed supervision, that wasn't happening. Where responsibility was diffuse enough to vanish. The agents understood then that whatever had happened had exploited that diffusion perfectly. They did not yet know who, or even if there was a single who, but they knew the event had been designed, consciously or not, to disappear into normalcy. The most unsettling discovery came from a cross-check that had never been possible before. The moment the clue was fully understood, it did not arrive with certainty. It arrived with resistance. Even the agents who had uncovered it hesitated to say it aloud, as if naming it would give it power, as if the shape of the past might rearrange itself the instant the words left their mouths. For years, the case had been defined by what was missing. Now, suddenly, something was there, and it did not behave the way answers were supposed to. The clue did not point to a single act of violence, or a dramatic confrontation, or an obvious villain hiding in the shadows. It pointed instead to a pattern so ordinary it had been invisible, a structure everyone had trusted, a role so familiar that no one had questioned it. The FBI team found themselves returning again and again to the same realization, each time more unsettling than the last. Nothing had gone wrong in the way people assumed. Things had gone right, too right. The birthday party had not been chaotic. That was the mistake. It had been smooth, predictable, flowing exactly as expected. Children moving between spaces. Adults assuming supervision without assigning it. Responsibility dissolving into comfort. The clue reframed the entire afternoon not as a lapse, but as a system operating as designed. The agents began reconstructing the day minute by minute, not to find a dramatic rupture, but to identify where trust had replaced awareness. They overlaid witness statements, not to resolve contradictions, but to locate moments of collective assumption, points where everyone thought someone else was watching. And in those moments, The clue fit perfectly. It suggested that the children had not been taken in a single instant, but gradually, in small groups, under circumstances that did not trigger alarm, that the absence had not been sudden enough to cause panic, that the silence had not been empty, but managed. This interpretation did not come easily. It required letting go of decades of narrative momentum. It required accepting that the horror of what happened lay not in spectacle, but in subtlety. That was harder to face. When the FBI cross-referenced the clue with archival data, something else emerged. A timeline discrepancy that had always been explained away as memory error now appeared intentional. The accepted window of disappearance narrowed. The margins tightened. The event had been contained within a far smaller frame than anyone had realized. That containment was the point. The clue did not answer where the children went. It answered how no one noticed them leaving. The implications rippled outward, destabilizing everything that had followed. Search patterns, media theories, public suspicion. Entire decades of speculation were suddenly misaligned, built on an assumption that no longer held. The agents understood immediately that revealing this would be dangerous, not physically, but psychologically. It would force people to confront the idea that the danger had not come from outside the community, but from within its routines, from its habits, from its unexamined trust. When the families were brought in, the room was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. No comforting language, no euphemisms. The agent spoke carefully, laying out the logic without filling in gaps that were still unproven. They explained what the clue did and did not mean. It did not identify a perpetrator. It did not explain motive. It did not locate the children. What it did was worse. It revealed that the story everyone had lived with for 31 years was incomplete in a fundamental way. Some parents listened in stunned silence. Others reacted with immediate anger. How could this have been missed? How could something so basic have gone unnoticed? The agents did not defend a past investigation. They did not need to. The weight of hindsight pressed down on everyone in the room. One parent asked a question no one wanted to answer. If this was true, how close were we? No one responded right away, because closeness was relative, and proximity did not guarantee understanding. The clue suggested that whoever or whatever had orchestrated the disappearance had relied on familiarity as camouflage, not deception in the dramatic sense, but expectation. Children expected to be guided. Adults expected things to be fine. No one expected the familiar to betray them. The families left that meeting changed, not relieved, not resolved. The answers they had waited decades for had not arrived. Instead, they carried something heavier, the knowledge that the truth had been closer than they imagined, hiding in plain sight, protected by normalcy. Word spread quickly, despite efforts to contain it. The phrase FBI clue appeared in headlines within days. Stripped of nuance, inflated by speculation, commentators filled airtime with interpretations that ranged from insightful to reckless. The public wanted something concrete. They wanted names. They wanted villains. What they got instead was discomfort. The idea that the disappearance had not required extraordinary force unsettled people. It challenged the comforting belief that danger announces itself loudly, that evil looks different from ordinary life. The clue undermined that separation. The aftermath did not arrive with resolution. It arrived with exhaustion, the kind that settles into the body after years of bracing for impact, only to realize the ground beneath you has shifted again. For the families, for the town, for even the investigators, the revelation did not close the story. It left it standing open, altered, heavier. Some parents felt something like relief, but it was fleeting and difficult to name. Not relief that their children had been found, or that justice had been served, but relief that the silence had finally been interrupted, that the case had not simply dissolved into time, that the questions they had carried for decades were not foolish or obsessive or imagined. Something had been wrong. Something had been missed. That validation mattered, even if it hurt. Others felt anger more sharply than ever before. Anger at systems, at assumptions, at the idea that their children had disappeared not because of extraordinary evil, but because ordinary trust had been misused. That kind of anger had no clear target. It could not be resolved through blame alone. It lingered, corrosive and unresolved. The families reacted in different ways. Some leaned into the renewed attention, speaking publicly again, insisting that the story not be simplified or sanitized. They wanted nuance. They wanted the discomfort preserved. Others withdrew completely, protecting what little emotional equilibrium they had left. They had lived too long inside the story to allow it to consume them again. There were difficult conversations within families, between spouses who had grieved differently, between siblings who had grown up in the shadow of absence, between parents and the memories they had carefully constructed over time. The new understanding did not erase old narratives. It complicated them. For some, it reopened guilt that had never fully healed. The idea that the disappearance had relied on assumption forced parents to revisit the day with fresh eyes, not to blame themselves again, but to reckon with how fragile safety had always been. That reckoning was painful, but also clarifying. It shifted the weight of responsibility away from individual moments and toward a broader, more unsettling truth about how easily trust can fail. The town responded unevenly. There were meetings, discussions, editorials. Some people wanted to talk openly about what the clue meant. Others wanted to move past it as quickly as possible. The tension between remembering and forgetting, always present, sharpened once more. No one wanted the town to be defined forever by what had happened, but no one could deny that it had been shaped by it. The revelation did not create that legacy. It simply exposed it more clearly. In quiet moments, people returned to the image of the party, not as it had been mythologized over the years, but as it truly was. Ordinary, unremarkable, full of trust. That ordinariness became the most haunting detail of all. It suggested that the line between safety and catastrophe was thinner than anyone wanted to believe. The FBI continued its work, but with humility that had not always been present in the early years. The clue had not solved the case. It had reframed it. That reframing guided new inquiries, but it also imposed limits. There was an understanding now that some answers might never arrive cleanly, that the truth, if it emerged at all, would do so imperfectly. Investigators were careful not to promise what they could not deliver. The families had lived too long with false certainty. What they offered instead was commitment, attention, refusal to let the case slip back into silence. As time passed, the intensity of the revelation softened, but its impact did not disappear. It settled into the collective consciousness alongside the original disappearance. Inseparable from it, the story now had layers. Not just loss, but understanding. Not just mystery, but insight for the parents who were still alive. The days continued much as they had before. Grief did not end. Love did not fade. The absence remained. But something subtle shifted. The story they told themselves about what happened became more honest, even if it was less comforting. They no longer imagined a single dramatic moment where everything went wrong. They understood now that the tragedy had unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, through a series of perfectly ordinary assumptions. That understanding did not ease the pain, but it gave it context. For those who had lost spouses before this new chapter, the knowledge arrived too late to be shared. That loss layered itself on top of everything else. Some parents spoke of wishing they could have had this conversation, even without answers, just to know they had not been wrong to keep asking. The children themselves remained absent, but not erased. They existed in memory, in stories told carefully, in the way parents still spoke their names. The years had not dimmed them. If anything, time had sharpened their presence. The ending of this story was not an ending at all. There were no arrests to announce, no confessions to dissect, no certainty to rest upon. Years later, when people tried to describe how the story finally settled, they struggled to find the right word. It did not end. It did not resolve. It did not even truly rest. It lingered, changing shape as it passed from one generation to the next, refusing to become something clean or distant. The disappearance had become part of the air the town breathed, unseen but always present. The backyard where the party once took place no longer looked the same. The fence had been replaced. The trees had grown taller, their branches thick and unrecognizable compared to old photographs. New families lived in the house now, unaware at first of what had happened there. When they eventually learned, as most did, the knowledge settled into their routines quietly. Children played there again. Laughter returned. And still, something about the space felt different to those who knew how to listen to absence. For the parents who remained, memory became a living thing. It evolved, softened at the edges, sharpened at the center. They stopped expecting answers to arrive with clarity or mercy. Instead, they learned how to live alongside uncertainty, how to carry love without destination. Some days were easier than others. None were untouched. They marked time in private ways. A birthday candle lit and blown out alone. A letter written and never sent. A pause on the calendar that no one else noticed. These rituals were not about hope anymore. They were about acknowledgement, about refusing to let the lives that vanished dissolve into abstraction. The world continued to ask questions, though less frequently now. Documentaries were made. Podcasts dissected the case with voices calm and analytical, sometimes too calm. Online forums debated theories late into the night. Strangers trying to impose logic onto a story that resisted it. The families listened from a distance, choosing carefully when to engage and when to turn away. What stayed with them was not the speculation, but the quiet understanding that the disappearance had revealed something fragile about the world. That safety is often a shared illusion. That trust, once broken, does not fully return to its original shape. Children who grew up hearing the story internalized it in subtle ways. They learned to count. They learned to notice who was watching and who was not. They learned that danger does not always look dangerous. Some carried that awareness into adulthood, becoming vigilant parents, careful neighbors, people who asked questions others might avoid. The FBI eventually scaled back its active involvement, though the case remained open on paper. Files were preserved, evidence cataloged, the door left unlocked, just in case. There was no announcement when the investigation entered this quieter phase. It simply happened, the way most endings do, gradually without ceremony. For some parents, that shift felt like a final confirmation of what they had already known, that the story, as far as institutions were concerned, had reached its limit, that the rest belonged to memory, to history, to the unanswered. Still, the clue remained, not as a solution, but as a lens. It changed how people understood what had happened and how they understood themselves in relation to it. It made the disappearance harder to dismiss, harder to package into something distant or extreme. It insisted that the danger had lived inside ordinary moments. That realization stayed with people long after the details faded. On quiet nights, some parents still imagine the sound of children laughing somewhere far away. Older now, changed, living lives that ran parallel to theirs without ever intersecting again. Other nights, they imagined nothing at all, choosing stillness over speculation. Both were acts of survival. The town held its breath less often now. Fear no longer dominated daily life, but awareness never fully left. It lived in locked doors and careful glances, in the way people watched children move through shared spaces, not with panic, but with intention. The story became something people referenced softly, with respect, not as entertainment, not as a mystery to be solved for its own sake, but as a reminder of loss, of responsibility.